He gave in to protesters' demands, withdrew a controversial bill and reshuffled his cabinet. But the Kenyan president is still under pressure. Tens of thousands of people have been calling for an end to what they say is corruption and mismanagement. So is real change possible in Kenya? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Kenya is on the edge again. Protests against a finance bill have become a nationwide movement, challenging the very foundations of President William Ruto's government. Young people are leading the charge, demanding lower taxes, an end to corruption and a government that listens. But as the demonstrations intensified, so too has the response. Dozens of activists and protesters were killed, others disappeared. Can President Ruto quell this dissent, or is Kenya on the brink of major political change? We'll put these questions and more to our panel in just a moment, but first, this report from Axel Zamovich.
People united!
Back on the streets once again. Young Kenyans are calling for President William Ruto to resign and demanding justice for those killed in security crackdowns.
We are not here for war. We are just here for our rights.
This one, yeah.
Sakayo, you must go. Depend spender, you must go.
What began as protests against the controversial finance bill that would have raised taxes has evolved into broader calls for an end to corruption. Since June, tens of thousands of Kenyans have taken part in demonstrations across the country. They intensified in July when MPs passed the bill. Protesters stormed parliament and set part of it on fire. The army was deployed and dozens of people were killed. Even though Ruto withdrew the proposed legislation, it failed to quell public anger. Young people say his promise of economic opportunities has amounted to nothing. The root cause of dissatisfaction lies in the cost of living crisis and perceived government corruption. The president has formed a new cabinet which includes opposition figures. But many Kenyans are skeptical anything will change. They say authorities have done little to follow up on the dozens of activists and protesters who have disappeared or been abducted by unknown men in plain clothes.
Majority of them are individuals who are actively involved, particularly in the social media platforms, to agitate for change in the country. These are individuals who are calling people to come out, who are calling people to share their concerns, to share their grievances with the government. When they disappear, some of them come back and some of them are found dead.
On Nairobi streets, young voices grow louder every day. Young Kenyans aren't just asking for change, they are demanding it. Axel Zamovich, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring in our guests now. And from London, we're joined by Nyabola, a political analyst and author of Digital Democracy, Analogue Politics, How the Internet Era is Transforming Politics in Kenya. From Nairobi, we're joined by Hassan Khannenje, Director of the Horn International Institute of Strategic Studies. And also in London, we have Ali Khan Sachu, an emerging markets economist and author. A very warm welcome to all of you. Hassan, first of all, tell us about the situation there in Nairobi today, because as we go to record this programme, we're seeing clouds of tear gas and a very heavy security presence in downtown Nairobi. What's going on there?
The situation has been tense, but steady since morning. Early in the morning, at least the better part of today, there haven't been as heavy protests as what was expected before. Either because of some of the political dynamics that took place in the last few weeks, but also I think owing to heavy presence of security services, not just in Nairobi but across the country. But the situation, of course, is still tense, and there is heavy deployment of security apparatus across the city.
Nanjala, why do you think we've been seeing the number of protesters decrease in recent weeks? Indeed, today there's just small pockets of people who are out on the streets and they're being met by an enormous security presence.
Well, I think the answer is in the question. The security response has been wildly disproportionate, not just in the immediate sense of the protests, but people being tracked to their homes, people being detained and arrested at various points. I think the abductions have really certainly chilled the atmosphere in the country. But then there's also a shift in the tactics and the strategies that are being used by the protesters. I think initially, because there was a single focal point for the protest, which was the finance bill, and now that there's a slightly more disparate impetus, there's not like one thing that people are responding to. It's much more difficult to get that spontaneous reaction that there was sort of at the beginning. But really, the violent response of the police, the chilling effect, the abductions, the disappearances, and the killings, that is probably a big reason why a lot of people opted not to participate in this round of protests.
Ali Khan, that of course is a big reason, as Nanjala says. To what extent as well is the reason because Ruto has withdrawn this finance bill and indeed reshuffled his government, which was sworn in today?
Well, I think, like Nanjala said, what we've seen is a focal point, which was the finance bill. That's no longer there. We've seen this elite bargain, which I think the president has achieved, which is amongst the politicians. I don't think that's a long-term solution. I think it's a very short-term solution, a very 20th century solution to a 21st century issue, which is this sort of uprising amongst the citizenry. So I think in the near term, this sort of a very hard approach, coupled with this elite bargain amongst the politicians, might have stemmed the tide temporarily. But I don't think that this is a long-lasting solution to the problem that we're facing. And I think that's going to unfold over the next few weeks.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Hassan, would you agree with that? Would you agree that this new government that Ruto has sworn in, full of familiar faces, albeit from the opposition, is not reflective of the people's demands?
Yeah, most certainly. I think perhaps it's not speaking to the larger demands of the popularly known as Gen Z in the country, but it has served to calm the passions, especially from position strongholds of Kenya, or areas that are perceived, to have been at the forefront, opposing government policies as well as government legislation. And so that in certain ways and certain aspects has actually calmed some of the sentiments that were being expressed. But of course, it is a short-term kind of a band-aid solution to, I think, a fundamental, challenge that is facing the country.
Nanjala, how short-term do you think we're talking here?
I actually don't think that it has changed anything. I think moving around the same people, circulating the same names throughout government, I think it appeases the political class, but I don't think it does anything for the grassroots. I think the big shift that has happened is the perception of the deep inequality that exists in the country. We saw through the process of vetting, the wealth declarations that were being made by all of these politicians. These are billionaires, and they are, dollar billionaires. And to have an elite class, whether they're in one political party or another political party, sort of shuffled around at a leadership level, doesn't actually address the problem at hand. Now, the protesters might be regrouping because, again, like I said, there isn't really a focal point in the way that there was with the finance bill and this really chilling effect, the fact that there are still at least 50 unaccounted for bodies at various morgues in the country, and even more people who are still being abducted and are being disappeared. That certainly affects the interests of ordinary people and going out into the streets and protesting. So I think I agree with the panelists that there's certainly been a kick the can down the road, that there is something that they haven't really fundamentally addressed. But I don't even think that the cabinet reshuffle has done really anything. I think what it has done is it appeases the political class, but, responding to a social economic problem with a political solution, he hasn't actually addressed the social and the political problem, which is the fact that people were resisting the austerity measures, people were resisting the unbalanced budget, the financial mismanagement in the country. And so I don't think it's actually addressed anything. What it has done is it's appeased the political class.
And Hassan, one of the key problems here for Ruto is that he was elected in on the promise that he would improve the standards of living for Kenyans who were struggling to get by. How has he failed to deliver on that?
I think there's always a difference between the political rhetoric when you confront the governance reality. And reality is very, very different. The country was at a crisis, point economically, and that was the reality. And I think because of that, there was a lot of hope, especially considering that the campaign of the current president, revolved around this hustler narrative, that perhaps he was going to be able to deliver the goods, in a very quick and efficient manner. But considering everything that has taken place, I think Kenyans are frustrated with the pace of reforms. They are frustrated with the pace of economic growth, and they're not seeing the economic fortunes grow. They've instead been seeing them decline, despite a fairly decent GDP growth for the country. And so the disconnect between sometimes what the macroeconomics may be saying and what microeconomics may be speaking to individuals has contributed to the frustration that, of course, was the finance bill pretty much was kind of the apex of that slammed up a lot of these frustrations. And yes, I do agree with my fellow panelists that was a uniting objective in trying to defeat it. But beyond that, there also seemed to be fatigue in the absence of very clear objectives with regard to these protests as well as demonstrations.
Ali, Kenya has the strongest economy in East Africa. It's got a growing GDP. It's investor-friendly. It's entrepreneurial. Where's all the money?
That's precisely the question. I think, when we are looking at it from a purely economic perspective, we really have to look at the previous administration of which the president was a part, but to some degree semi-detached. We saw an explosion in borrowing under that administration, approximately $42 billion, the flagship of which was this railway, which is a diesel-motored railway. Frankly, if you compare it to any other railway that's been put in the last 10 years, it's about 50 years too old in terms of its style, in terms of what it's delivered, and it wasn't even completed. So we saw this splurge in borrowing, an incredible exponential surge in borrowing. We saw a lot of money misspent, and essentially the bill has come due. And the president has the challenge that, that bill is due. He went to the IMF, went to the World Bank, got a deal with them. But part of that deal was to stick up taxes. And people are saying, look, you've gone beyond our tolerance levels. The next step then would be to reduce the government footprint and its expenditure. But obviously, from what we saw recently, that will not be done. And typically, these sorts of governments of national unity, or whatever you want to characterize it as, are a looting party. And it'll be highly unfortunate because then it will compound the problem. So we've got a very, very talented workforce, a country with a lot of promise, but unfortunately we're deep in a hole, and it doesn't seem anyone has got a spade, the right spade to get us out of it.
Nanjala, given that you have written a book on how the political system is out of touch with the new generation, how do you think politicians have been caught off guard by these protests and by Gen Z being so politically engaged and demanding so much of their politicians in a way perhaps the previous generation didn't?
I think what technology has shifted is the ability of people to find each other and to amplify each other and to sort of be able to be dissatisfied together in a way that under analog systems, under, previous media regimes, you wouldn't be able to do, right? You would be receiving information, but you wouldn't necessarily be connecting with your peers. You wouldn't be exchanging ideas. And that's one of the things that this particular mobilization has done that is very, very distinct, that there's a lot of peer-to-peer communication, education, initiatives that people are taking to translate. The finance bill was translated into multiple languages across the country by volunteers, the initiatives that are being undertaken to share information, and and that young people really in various localities in the country have more in common today than they might have had 20 years ago, just because of the way information circulates in the country. So that's really one big difference that's caught the political class off guard. But really, the other big difference is this idea that young people are stupid. And this is a pervasive idea in political systems all over the world, that to be young is equated with to be uninformed, with being stupid. And really, that is just consistently proven to be untrue. It's untrue in Bangladesh, it's untrue in Kenya, it's untrue pretty much everywhere else, that youth is not equated to being uninformed. And so really that's what's caught them off guard, that the presumption was, that age kind of locks in a certain wisdom and a certain perspective on issues, but really, wisdom is not a function of age. You can find information, you can study things, you can understand things. And in fact, historically, people are at their most politically active when they're at university age, because they have the time and they have the tools to be able to engage with ideas in a much deeper way than people who are having to balance professional lives and children and all of that sort of thing. So I think that's one of the things that's caught them off guard. They just assumed that young people were stupid, and young people are proving that they're not.
Okay, yes, and interesting you mentioned that, because of course now, with joblessness being so high, way in the 30% for young people, they still have the time to get angry and to get engaged in politics, because the opportunities to get into a career and get decent paying jobs are just not there. Why is that, Hassan?
I think one thing that is important, to note is that, Kenya, like many countries in East Africa, about 60 to 70% of the population is made up of young people, majority of who are under 30 years old. And Kenya is churning out about 1 million people, every year into the job market. But the economic growth is just not sufficient to be able to absorb the numbers that, of course, we're witnessing coming from out there. Now, outside, the growth of around 10% is going to be increasingly difficult for countries in the region, especially Kenya, to be able to meet those demands. But at the same time, I think generally as societies, we're moving a little bit too slow in responding to the new needs and as well as job opportunities that the young people require, especially the jobs of tomorrow. And so to the extent that perhaps we're not moving quick enough in terms of ensuring the macroeconomics and microeconomics are meeting the demands, but we're also not moving fast enough to innovate and create more opportunities for young people.
Hassan, I can just see that Nanjala wants to jump in there. If you can just jump in, Nanjala, with what you want to say.
Yeah, I wanted to say that there's a more structural issue at play here, which is really that young people have been told that if they did XYZ steps, that they would achieve certain things and that it would unlock a certain lifestyle. Today, in most countries in the world, and Kenya is certainly not an exception, young people are more educated than their parents. On paper, they earn more than their parents. Like the numbers are higher than what their parents did. They've done all of the things that they were told to do and that would unlock a certain lifestyle, and those lifestyles aren't there. In African countries, a particular crisis is emerging because there are people who are too educated. There's not enough land for people to be farmers. They've been told that agriculture is not an option. Agricultural land is being shifted towards private ownership, towards mass corporate ownership. But at the same time, as Hassan is saying, none of these sort of blue-collar jobs or white-collar jobs are being made available, or even high-quality blue-collar jobs are being made available to young people. So in addition to all of these sort of issues, we also have to talk about the structural inequalities that are being created by the socioeconomic systems that have been adopted in the global majority. And fundamentally what it is that promise that was made to young people that hasn't been delivered anywhere else. And my argument has always been on this issue, is that we're paying attention to Kenya now, but this is a crisis that the whole world needs to pay attention to. Between climate change, between structural inequality, between the lack of opportunities that are being generated by the macroeconomic model that's being embraced around the world, we are heading for a global crisis, because the vast majority of people in the world are below the age of 35.
Ali Khan, if I could just pick up on what Nanjala is saying about Western structures being imposed on the global South, if you will. What is the perception in Kenya that the IMF, that the World Bank are calling the shots and forcing the government to make austerity measures, spending cuts, when perhaps it's not best for the country itself?
So absolutely, the perception has been that this is a redux of the 80s and the 90s, when the IMF and the World Bank largely ran the show in so many third world countries. However, I think that's unfair. What we really have, one's got to look at the original sin. The original sin was that essentially the previous government inherited a very, very solid balance sheet, and they just went crazy with the credit card. The country was in a very good place a few years ago, I would say 10, 15 years ago. It was growing fast, taxes were low. Under the Kibaki administration, the economy was being run optimally. We then went into a situation where we blew the money. I remember the previous president talking about how, just look at Japan, we can borrow, the similar amount of money. Obviously, we couldn't. And there was this myth out there that we could just borrow as much as we wanted. We misspent it, and now we're having to pay the bill. And therefore, to go and complain to the IMF and the World Bank is a little bit unfair, because ultimately there was nobody else to bail us out. International markets weren't interested. The domestic market can't take much more borrowing. I mean, already we're paying interest rates the government is paying interest rates of 18, 19% in the local market. So we had to go to the lender of last resort. There were no other options. But not to look behind the reasons, I think, has been an issue for me, because it just means we're unable really to diagnose the problem. And the problem was very simple. We had economically illiterate leadership, and we're paying the price for that now.
Hassan, massive overspending, as Ali Khan says. What problem as well does corruption lead to? Because that is an endemic problem in Kenya. It is not been addressed properly by successive governments. How difficult is it to root out?
The problem is not just that for quite some time now we've been living beyond our means. The problem is that much of sometimes what we've been getting actually in terms of taxes as well as loan has disappeared through corrupt practices, either procurement or contracting, and that is serious. And it has made a serious dent on our ability to be able to put resources together for development projects. Today, as we speak, the development budget is actually pretty small, and a large percentage of the money we are collecting is going towards debt servicing. So this has been serious, and it is part of the reason that I think has inspired the protest movement you see, because corruption has also been one of the big agenda items for those who are protesting the streets in the recent weeks.
Nanjala, there is a huge public debt in Kenya. We're looking at $78 billion, 70% of the GDP. How does the government go about repaying that, if not with taxes?
Kenya doesn't have a revenue problem. Kenya has an expenditure problem. Kenya has a problem in how it prioritizes spending. We're overspending on the legislature. Kenyan legislatures are the second highest paid relative to GDP in the world. We're overpaying. We have a bloated administration precisely because it was an elite compact. This idea that we would diffuse competition for the presidency by moving some of that competition down into gubernatorial, into MCA. It's an enormous government that, 48 million people don't need this much government. There's an over-government problem. And the spending that is being done is being spent on things that are not really a financial priority at the moment. I think that if you look at, for example, when they did the vetting for the cabinet secretaries and they looked at the rate at which the private finances of all of these cabinet secretaries have grown in 2.5 years, 38% average. That's a question that needs to be asked. Where did this money come from? How are people who are in charge of government able to grow their personal finances by 38% in 2.5 years while the rest of the country is actually shrinking? That needs to be addressed. Are we taking care of farmers? This is an agricultural country. Why aren't farmers able to get a decent deal on tea, coffee, maize, and all of these key crops? There's a problem there with the administration, with a tolerance for government. And it goes back to mismanagement, and it goes back to what Ali Khan was saying. One of the ways in which this administration was able to get into power was because it made a series of deals, of political deals with people. And those people go into government expecting to get money back that they put into getting elected. They're not there because they want to govern properly. They're not there because they want to lead properly. They're there because they want to grow their personal finances. So ordinary people are being asked to foot the bill for the elite compact. Really, fundamentally, what needs to be done is to heal, to close the chapter in 2007, to stop using the government as a way to pay back, political cronies, and to go back to the fundamentals of government. Why do we have a government? We're overspending or we're overgoverned.
Okay, Ali Khan, I mean, it feels that the changes that Ruto has made so far, withdrawing the finance bill, reshuffling the government, hasn't really touched the sides of the deep-rooted demands of the people. What is the most urgent thing that Ruto needs to do in order to properly quell this unrest?
Well, I think the first thing he should have done was to have appointed a completely different set of people to these very important positions. I mean, I listened to the vetting process, and the points made by most of these folks about the ministries to which they're being appointed was superficial and facile. There are plenty of Kenyans out there who are supremely qualified to have been appointed to those positions. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think he's got to think beyond this elite bargaining, since independence type of thinking. It's just not going to work. It's a very short-term band-aid. He should have reached out to the majority. These people on the streets are the majority of the country. They're articulating their requirements. And I think just to think they're going to wear them down, use a ham-fisted approach in the street is going to work. I don't think it's going to work. And then finally, I think, with respect to the debt profile, because that is really the intractable problem, he is not going to be able to tax his way back to a sustainable economy. He's going to have to go to the IMF and World Bank and say, guys, I need a longer lead time. He's going to have to look for some debt forgiveness, and he's going to have to start negotiating on that front. Without those three, that trifecta, I don't think the solution is going anywhere.
OK, well, we will have to see whether he adopts any of those moves. Many thanks, Nanjala, Nyabola, Hassan Khannenje and Ali Khan Sachu. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.